Hi there, welcome to Inde-Car on the 17th of April. Now, there are a couple of new statistics being published today which I think make interesting reading as far as Scotland is concerned anyway. And I think the most interesting one of all, so far at least, is that the unemployment figures have just been published by the Office for National Statistics. Now, the national headline rate of unemployment across the UK is approximately 4.2% of the population who are currently economically inactive. In other words, they're not in paid employment or they're seeking work. But in Scotland, that figure is less. It's less by quite a bit, actually. As far as I remember, Scotland's unemployment rate is somewhere around 4%, so it's a good bit below the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, it seems to have dropped back quite a bit over the winter months. I think it's fallen by another 0.4% during the winter of 2023-2024, as more people find jobs in Scotland than anywhere else in the United Kingdom, which is obviously great news. I'm not sure why there's a difference here. It could be that confidence in Scottish businesses is higher. It could simply be that there are more jobs in Scotland than there once were. Whatever the news is and whatever the reason for it, it's good news. So this is something we should celebrate. But that's not the only piece of good news to come out of the ONS. Accident and emergency waiting times across the United Kingdom are very high. In England and Wales, I believe that the figure essentially for, let's start with Northern Ireland and Wales first of all, their percentage of A&E patients waiting longer than 12 hours, that's a hell of a long time to wait for emergency treatment, is between 14 and 16% respectively. In England, the figure is slightly higher than that in Scotland as well, but we do have the lowest waiting times for accident and emergency cases. In terms of the percentage of people who are forced to wait in accident and emergency units for longer than 12 hours. So Scotland is outperforming with its NHS as well as with its domestic employment. So both of these are good signs. They show that Scotland is being well managed, even if we don't necessarily agree with everything that the SNP and the Green government does. Essentially, Scotland's governance is working well, despite the fact that it doesn't have all its tax resources to actually work with. Unfortunately, there's always got to be a downside. The downside is that because we're in the United Kingdom and because largely the England and Wales population voted for Brexit in 2016, we hadn't until recently felt the full effects of what Brexit actually means. But this year sees the introduction of tariffs on goods entering the United Kingdom from the European Union. Now, these were delayed, I suspect, in order to keep the Tories afloat, so that people would be fooled into thinking that Brexit actually hadn't harmed the UK economy in any way and wasn't really going to do any harm to the high street. But you'd be wrong if you thought that, because it's been revealed today, particularly on Scotland's high streets, that small artisan shops such as delicatessens, for example, which import foods from the continent, and also specifically cheesemongers. Now, you might think, well, cheesemongering is something we hadn't seen in Scotland for a long time until fairly recently. And of course, artisan cheeses, the kind that are imported from the continent, sometimes are not pasteurised, and those unpasteurised cheeses, which often fetch the highest prices and are the most sought after, are subject to new hygiene controls, which is fine. You know, you've got to check that things are fine and they're not contaminated with bacteria. However, what it means is that any foods being imported from the European Union which are not fresh fruit or vegetables, this is processed foods we're talking about here, but any foods such as dairy, for example, and meat, are now subject to tariffs. And these tariffs are pretty big, anywhere from, I think it was something like £29 up to well over £130 per consignment coming into the UK. And this is a duty which is levied to supposedly protect the United Kingdom's food standards. Now, that may well be the case, but the problem is that this is an extra taxation, and this is pushing the prices of things like artisan cheeses and delicatessen foods to the point where shops that exist at the moment would not be able to pass on the massive rise in these costs, without going under. And two or three shop owners have been interviewed by the press recently and said that if these prices do go up, and they expect them to double for this type of imported foodstuff, if they double, then they would essentially go out of business because people would just not be prepared to pay double the price, or they might just buy half the amount. Either way, those cheesemongers and delicatessens buying this stuff would end up having to take a big hit. And obviously, with business rates and the actual amount of money you can earn before paying business rates having been cut now from £1,500 to £1,200 a month, I believe. Check my figures on that. It could be wrong, but because the actual amount you can earn before you pay rates on a shop has dropped, that has pushed the running costs of these shops up, not to mention the fact that electricity costs and other heating and refrigeration costs have gone up as much as 100% in the last year or so. And also some statistics recently revealed that the electricity companies in the United Kingdom before 2023 were making about £74 million a year. And now that has not just doubled, but it's gone up tenfold. They are now making over £741 million a year for the same electricity produced in the same way by the same companies. So you can see why these shops are struggling and why they're worried now about these Brexit tariffs being introduced. And these are not the only tariffs. This is the start of a whole tranche of new strict controls, tariffs and taxes which are going to be imposed on any goods coming into the United Kingdom from abroad. And remember that the European Union will be doing the same thing on the other side of the channel for goods that are being exported from United Kingdom nations such as Scotland, which exports a fair amount of prime beef amongst other things, and salmon, of course, and many other foodstuffs. Anything that's going from here to the European Union will also be subject to high tariffs and taxation, all of which is going to make it extremely difficult for people buying and selling foodstuffs into and out of the European Union. And that is going to hurt businesses and close shops on the high street. So it's not good news. And it's all a result of being trapped in the United Kingdom, where, as we know, 68% of the Scottish population across every sector and every region voted against Brexit. And yet, here we are, suffering from the effects of Brexit years after the fact. I mean, we're talking now, 8 years after the vote, now we're finally seeing the end result. But it's coming. Now, in a final piece today, somebody said to me in response to a tweet recently about sovereignty, that simply declaring sovereignty in Scotland would not get us independence. This is something which I think the SNP thinks. I'm making a big jump here, and this is an assumption on my part, that many in the SNP traditional party think that declaring sovereignty doesn't mean anything. Well, declaring it maybe wouldn't mean anything, but since the sovereignty exists in Scots law, a simple acknowledgement by Holyrood that Scots law is still in force, and that means the Constitution of Scotland is still in force. And that also means that the sovereignty of the people is still in force. An acknowledgement, a public acknowledgement voted on by Holyrood, which states that the people of Scotland are sovereign above all other authorities in this country, would change the entire political landscape. Because if Holyrood were to accept that popular sovereignty exists in Scottish law, which it does, and they accepted it publicly and voted on it, that would enable us to hold a referendum at any time we wanted, about anything we wanted, including, obviously, leaving the United Kingdom, if we wanted to do that, and also about the royal family, whether we want that or not, and also nuclear weapons, whether we want to retain those or not. All of those things would become possible with popular sovereignty acknowledgement by the political classes in Scotland. So you might be asking, well, why are the political classes not acknowledging it? The simple answer to that is that would be to take their power away. Because the political classes in Scotland, the MSPs and MPs elected to the two parliaments under the United Kingdom's devolved system, they assume that they have priority in Scotland. That means the MSPs, all of the elected MSPs, are working under the assumption that it is they who have been given the sovereignty by us to run Scotland, or they've been given the sovereignty of Scotland to act on our behalf at Westminster. Technically, this is just not true, because to do that you would have to accept the sovereignty of Westminster, which is what is actually a question here. So simply declaring your sovereignty wouldn't be enough. It has to be made official, and it would have to be made official by all of Scotland's elected officials. And that would mean that all of the MSPs in Holyrood would have to have a vote on it, and a majority would need to be in favour of accepting that the claim of right is law, and that Scots law still exists and is still in force, and that means that popular sovereignty, by extension, is also still in force. And that would be an acknowledgement by a political class in Scotland that they do not have sovereignty. And that would mean that we, the people, would be their bosses. And that would mean they would have to hold referendums on anything that involved the entire nation in the future. But having said that, would that put their jobs at risk? I don't think so. They might think it might, but on the other hand, if they did what the people asked and held referendums on all the important matters that affect the entire country, they would more likely be elected back into office again than those who do not. So I have to wonder why it is that no political party, particularly the SNP, ALBA, and even the Greens, who seem completely disinterested at the moment, have never actually thought about doing this. A bill to actually acknowledge the claim of right as Scotland's working constitution and until we get something better, and acknowledge that the people in Scotland are sovereign and that the King isn't sovereign and Westminster isn't sovereign here, would allow us to vote on anything we wanted to vote about. And that would not shut out those who disagree. Those Scots in Scotland who still believe we should remain part of the Union would be perfectly entitled to vote in such a referendum. And if they voted in a majority to stay in the UK, then that is what would happen. But at least the people would have spoken. The problem at the moment is that people are being gagged. We're not allowed to speak. We're not allowed to vote. We're not being given any opportunity or access to normal democracy by the United Kingdom, and that means essentially we're being treated as a colony. And that just will not do. So I think it's high time our politicians actually started to discuss the idea of popular sovereignty being acknowledged by Holyrood at the very least, and by at least a majority of our MPs in Westminster. Because if a majority of both sets of elected officials acknowledge the sovereignty of the Scots, then we can hold referendums on whatever we like. And we don't have to ask anybody's permission, we just order our politicians to do so. And that is the way that Switzerland runs its affairs, and look how successful they are. Anyway, that's it from today's Inde-Car. I will see you again later in the week, and I hope you will keep the faith, as I always say, and keep watching this programme. And by the way, please keep sharing the programme as widely as you can. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.